Clarice Lispector once said that she writes as if to save a life, probably her own. Her books enact consciousness. Reading her is like encountering perception before it hardens into an explanation, or encountering a sensation before it becomes domesticated by plot. For context, I am a huge fan of Clarice Lispector. Her writings have been a part of my life for a very, very long time. I haven't read everything yet, but I have read 9 of her novels. I have read Hour of the Star, The Chandelier, The Besieged City, An Apprenticeship or the Book of Pleasures, The Apple in the Dark, The Passion According to G.H., A Breath of Life, Agua Viva, and Near to the Wild Heart. I'm also a huge lover of philosophy, and in the process of reading Lispector, I can see so many varied, different schools of philosophical thought in her work. As I've read her, I've seen her belonging at the crossing of phenomenology, existentialism, negative theology, and feminist theory, but she refuses to sit still in any of them. And so today I thought it might be fun to go through Clarice Lispector's works and highlight the different schools of philosophical thought that can be found there. So let's start with phenomenology, which is a school of philosophy which means the study of experience as it is lived. At the start of the 20th century, a German thinker by the name of Edmund Husserl wondered if we could describe the world exactly as it appears. His student, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, later took this further. He said that our bodies aren't simply just a container for the mind, they are the way in which the world becomes real to us. The body is the place where thought and matter meet. And Lispector's work is very phenomenological. Her debut novel, Near to the Wild Heart, follows a girl named Joanna, whose awareness feels very raw and new. The book reads as a notebook of experience before it gets conceptualized into thought. It's very common to read a book where it's like a description of events, but in Lispector's first book, she inhabits perception. That is straight out of the phenomenological impulse. Not what do I think the world is, but what is it like as the world arrives. Maurice Merleau-Ponty called this the primacy of perception. In Near to the Wild Heart, every perception feels primal. One of my favorite passages from the book is, she wanted even more to be reborn always, to sever everything that she had learned, that she had seen, and inaugurate herself in a new terrain, where every tiny act had a meaning, where the air was breathed as if for the first time. This, the desire to return to pure perception, to see the world before habit or thought dulls it. Joanna wishes to be reborn always. She wants to encounter existence as it unfolds, to let reality reveal itself rather than impose meaning upon reality. Edmund Husserl called this a return to things themselves, a bracketing of assumptions so that we might perceive experience freshly as it gives itself. And that's exactly what Joanna is trying to do intuitively, to sever everything she has learned. Now, Joanna's thoughts are not logical. They are a series of perceptions giving birth to another. She feels herself thinking. She watches thought rise and dissolve. In one moment, she says, everything in me is movement. Everything in me is living. Even Joanna's sense of self shifts with each perception. She doesn't narrate from this stable first person I. One moment she's a girl, the next she is pure consciousness. This instability, this constant becoming, is the essence of lived experience in phenomenology. Husserl called it intentionality. Consciousness is always conscious of something. Joanna is never separate from what she perceives. She is shaped by what she perceives. And the title itself, Near to the Wild Heart, perfectly captures this state. It comes from a line from James Joyce: he was alone, unheeded, happy, and near to the wild heart of life. But Lispector's wild heart is not this sort of romantic freedom. It is the primal pulse of existence, unmediated by language or by reason. So essentially, reading the novel feels like you are in the birth, that you are inside the birth of awareness. 30 years later, in her book Agua Viva, she pushes this even further. It's a book with no plot and no characters, it's just pure consciousness, but we will get to that one later. So, if phenomenology is about how we experience the world, existentialism asks what it means to exist at all. The term comes from mid-century thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Simone de Beauvoir, writers responding to a century of war and disillusionment. They argued that life has no built-in meaning and that each person must create meaning through choice. Lispector's characters hit the same cliff Sartre and de Beauvoir describe. In The Passion According to G.H., a well-off woman crushes a cockroach in her apartment, and she expects this sort of disgust, but what she finds instead is revelation. As she looks at the insect's crushed body, she says, "I entered the core of my own nothingness." That is the existentialist moment. When everything familiar collapses and you face the terrifying freedom of being alive. In this single line, "I entered the core of my own nothingness," Lispector captures something that the German philosopher Martin Heidegger called angst, an ontological mood, the deep unease that comes when the scaffolding of meaning just falls away. In his 1927 work, Being and Time, Heidegger describes angst as the moment where all the familiar reference points of life, work, relationships, goals, suddenly lose their solidity. The world no longer appears as a collection of useful things. Instead, it opens into a terrifying emptiness. Yet this emptiness is also a kind of truth, stripped from the distractions we encounter being itself. And that's exactly what happens in The Passion According to G.H. The narrator's comfortable life collapses in an instant. A crushed cockroach becomes a mirror that reflects her entire existence, staring back at her, bare and meaningless. In that confrontation, she feels herself dissolve. I entered the core of my own nothingness. But for both Heidegger and Lispector, that nothingness is where actual authenticity begins. Going back to the existentialists, for them, entering the core of nothingness is the moment of a philosophical crisis. And I think this is where they differ, because for Lispector, it's becoming something more mystical as opposed to a crisis. So if the existentialists look into the void and find meaning's absence, mystics look into the same void and find God. So let's talk about negative theology. The idea that the divine can't be described directly. You approach it not by saying what God is, but by stripping away everything that he isn't. It goes back to early Christian and medieval mystics like Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite and later Meister Eckhart, a 13th century German Dominican who believed that God is not something we can define or imagine. The moment we try to describe God, we shrink him into something human, something finite. So instead of saying what God is, Eckhart and others tried to approach the divine by saying what God is not. God is not light, not darkness, not being, not nothing. He is beyond all categories of human thought. For Eckhart, the soul's only task was to let go of all images and concepts, to empty itself completely, because only in that inner silence could the divine presence become known. He wrote, "There is nothing so much like God in all the universe as silence. And there is a huge silence inside of each of us that beckons us into itself, which can teach us the language of heaven." This theology of unknowing, of approaching truth through surrender rather than mastery is exactly what Clarice Lispector performs in prose. In The Passion according to G.H., when the narrator stares at the crushed cockroach and says, I was seeing the before of the before, the world's matter before humanity, she's experiencing what Eckhart would call detachment, the moment when all familiar meaning dissolves and she confronts the sheer fact of existence. Like the mystics, Lispector doesn't try to define God. She tries to feel the divine in the raw pulse of being. When she sees the crushed cockroach, she says, that white matter was the world's core, divinity's own paste. Just as Eckhart taught that the divine can only be known by letting go of knowledge, the Passion according to G.H. keeps dismantling language, logic, and even identity until what's left is pure awareness. She approaches divinity by descending into the matter of the crushed insect and into silence. Simone Weil once wrote that absolutely unmixed attention is prayer. Simone Weil was a French mystic and philosopher writing during the 1930s and 40s, and one of my personal favorites. She was this strange, very luminous mind who worked in factories, who lived among the poor, and refused comfort as a form of solidarity with the poor. In her book, Gravity and Grace, she posits that when the mind attends to something completely, without ego or distraction, that act of attention itself becomes sacred. Clarice Lispector makes that act of attention an entire book in The Passion according to G.H. Our narrator's encounter with the crushed cockroach becomes a Simone Weilian act of taken to the extreme. She looks so closely, so relentlessly, that perception stops being human and becomes elemental. What begins as a revulsion at the insect turns into a revelation. Both Simone Weil and Clarice Lispector dissolve the distance between the observer and the observed. To look with total attention is to become the thing you are looking at, to lose the boundary between self and the world. Lispector forces attention into places where most people would avert their eyes: dirt, insects, decay. Her gaze refuses hierarchy. The human and the inhuman, the beautiful and the disgusting, they all share the same light. Whereas mystics look up toward the divine, Lispector looks down into dust, into paste, whatever life most people refuse to see, the cockroach. After the violent encounter with the cockroach, G.H. begins to sense that she has crushed not an alien life, but her own reflection in another form. She writes, I am the cockroach. I am my leg. I am my hair. I am the section of brightest light on the wall plaster. I am every hellish piece of myself. Life is so pervasive in me that if they divide me in pieces like a lizard, the pieces will keep on shaking and writhing. Here, I think, we cross into the territory of Emmanuel Levinas, the French Jewish philosopher who survived the Second World War and built an entire moral philosophy around the face of the other. Levinas argued that ethics begins in the moment one being encounters another. To see another's face is to be called to responsibility, to be reminded that you are not alone in existence, and that this recognition that the other exists just as fully as you do. By forcing herself to look at the creature without flinching, G.H. dismantles the hierarchy that separates human from non-human, beautiful from disgusting, divine from profane. She writes, it was the total that I had touched, and the total was nothing. It was the thing itself, the material of life, and in that instant, I was the world. This awareness that everything alive, everything that exists, shares the same pulse of being is what I find most extraordinary in GH. I now want to move to talk about language. Lispector's sentences test what words can and can't do. I don't think she's interested in style for its own sake, but in breaking apart language. In Agua Viva, she confesses, to write is to lose control of writing, to be beyond language. And her prose often feels like it's written in real time, right at the edge of comprehension. You can almost hear thought trying to find its own shape. And this struggle has a very long philosophical lineage. In the early 20th century, the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein devoted himself to understanding the limits of language. In his 1921 work, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he tried to map the relationship between words, thought, and the world, to determine what exactly can be said with clarity and what lies beyond the reach of speech. He concluded of what matters the most: ethics, beauty, God, meaning. These things cannot actually be said, they can only be shown. And his final proposition reads, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. In other words, once you reach the limit of language, you must fall silent before mystery. But I feel like Clarice Lispector refuses that silence. I feel as though Lispector writes toward the unsayable. In Agua Viva, sentences loop and fragment, circling the same thought from new angles. She writes not to express what she knows, but to find out what can be known through the act of writing itself. And to delve a little bit deeper into this movement toward the unsayable, in the 1970s, the French writer and theorist Hélène Cixous, who I talked about, I think, on my first video on this channel, she began to teach a series of seminars at the University of Paris dedicated entirely to Lispector's work, what I would have given to be at those lectures. Cixous recognized in Lispector something she had been trying to articulate for years, a form of writing that doesn't separate intellect from intuition or mind from flesh, a writing that thinks through the body. And she called it écriture féminine, or feminine writing, in her essay The Laugh of Medusa, though she was quick to say it wasn't limited to women, but to a way of thinking and feeling that works to express the ineffable and what can't be expressed in more structuralist language. For centuries, philosophical language and much of literary prose has been built around binaries: reason, emotion, mind, body, order, chaos, and the feminine was usually relegated to the irrational, the messy, the inexpressible. Cixous and other feminist philosophers like Luce Irigaray and Julia Kristeva argued that these binaries weren't natural truths, instead they were linguistic habits, and to break them, writing itself had to change. When Cixous encountered Clarice Lispector, she found a writer who had already done this intuitively. Sentences move the way the body moves, cyclical, fluid, full of pauses, repetitions, and hesitations. In Agua Viva, Lispector writes, I am made of water and time. I am writing with my whole body. That line itself could be the manifesto of écriture féminine. Cixous said that reading Lispector is like encountering a body that writes itself, a body that births and breathes sentences. She also notes that Lispector's narrators often speak from a kind of third space, neither fully self nor other, neither masculine nor feminine, neither human nor divine. This third body, as Cixous calls it, is the same space Lispector's characters inhabit when they lose their ordinary sense of identity and merge into something larger. Cixous' insight is that Lispector doesn't write about transcendence or embodiment. She writes as transcendence. She writes as embodiment. Her prose is the feminine in the sense that it moves according to the rhythms of feeling, intuition, and birth. And for Cixous, this makes Clarice Lispector revolutionary. And if the European feminists of the 1970s were theorizing the need for a feminine language, Lispector had already written this decades earlier. Recent academic work has widened this conversation even further. Scholars argue that Lispector creates philosophical ideas. Her fiction functions as philosophy, and this scholarship has moved from leading reading Lispector through philosophy to letting philosophy emerge from her work. What this shows, and what I firmly believe, is that Lispector is not a novelist who happens to sound philosophical. She is a thinker in her own right. She writes to propose a new way of knowing. And I think this is what keeps her so contemporary. In a world that's obsessed with certainty and categorization, Lispector's prose communicates that understanding does not end in logic, but embraces life's paradoxes and life's ambiguities. I now want to move to time. Lispector's late style is obsessed with time, time as it is lived and felt. In Agua Viva, Lispector tries to write the present as it happens. She calls it the living instant. But the more she tries to capture it, the more it dissolves. She writes in Agua Viva, I am trying to grasp the present, but it escapes me, running between my fingers. It always already passed. What she's describing is what the French philosopher Henri Bergson called durée or duration, the continuous flow of time as it is experienced rather than chopped into measurable fragments. Bergson, writing in the early 20th century, argued that time as lived by consciousness is not linear, it is layered. It carries the past folded into every moment of the present. Lispector's Agua Viva, in this sense, is Bergsonian to its core. She writes time as breath and rhythm, a form of being that can't be measured, it can only be inhabited. Her narrator says, I am the hour and the now. I am before. I am almost. I am never. If phenomenology was her method of writing perception, then Agua Viva is her phenomenology of time. But in her final novel, The Hour of the Star, time takes on a new weight. The book begins with a really startling opening. All the world began with a yes. One molecule said yes to another molecule, and life was born. That first yes is metaphysics condensed into a single act of affirmation. At the moment of creation, the world doesn't reason, the world doesn't explain, it simply consents. In philosophical terms, it's a Spinozist moment. The 17th century philosopher Spinoza imagined God as the very substance of existence itself, an infinite reality expressing itself through every finite thing. For Spinoza, to know God is to recognize that everything that exists is part of one endless motion, a divine yes that repeats itself in every molecule and every breath. After a lifetime of writing about fear, disintegration, and the void, her final book turned towards affirmation. To keep saying yes to existence, even when meaning fails, even when the self dissolves. In this sense, The Hour of the Star reframes all of Lispector's previous experiments, the phenomenology of perception in Near to the Wild Heart, the existential crisis of The Passion According to G.H., the mystical silence of Agua Viva, as stages leaning toward this ethical and ontological resolution. The world begins again whenever we say yes. The narrator, Rodrigo, acts almost like a divine voice trying to create a story. He finally understands that creation itself, the act of writing, of attending to another human being, is the continual repetition of this primordial yes. To write is to let the world be reborn through attention. Philosophically, this is both a Spinozan yes and a Bergsonian yes. From Bergson, Lispector inherits the idea that time is creative, that life perpetually invents itself in duration. From Spinoza, she inherits the sense that divinity is not separate from life, but pulsing within it. Her affirmation is the courage to keep beginning. That's why the title itself, The Hour of the Star, is so precise. It's an hour, a moment of becoming, a spark of illumination inside the vast and indifferent flow of time. And so the yes becomes Lispector's final philosophy. To live, for her, is to participate in that yes. She's not so much interested in explaining, she wants to echo this yes. As Rodrigo says near the end of the book, as long as I have questions and no answers, I shall go on writing. As long as I have time, I must say yes to life, and therefore I must say yes to death, which is the same as saying yes to life. And in this simple, single passage, Lispector says the human answer to the divine vibration that sustains the world is yes. We're approaching the end now. Thank you so much if you have lasted this long. I want to end where we began, which is the quote from Lispector saying, "I write as if to save somebody's life, probably my own." Writing as necessity. Her narrators write not because they want to, but because they have to, as if language was the only way to survive consciousness. So writing, in this sense, arises from compulsion. Her characters want to describe reality, even if it means failing constantly. In The Passion, according to G.H., the protagonist calls her revelation a terrifying joy. In Agua Viva, the narrator begs forgiveness in her incoherence. In The Hour of the Star, Rodrigo repeatedly interrupts his own story, doubting his right to even tell it. Each voice struggles to accept the sheer fact that reality simply is, and we must live inside of it whether or not it makes sense. For Lispector, this acceptance is a discipline. To write is to return again and again to the moment where words fail, and to keep writing anyway. It's the search that gives meaning to life, not the finding. Her writing enacts what the philosopher Maurice Blanchot called the infinite conversation, the dialogue that never resolves because meaning is always moving. You can feel it in her rhythm, the way in which a paragraph will start with certainty and then unravel into doubt and then end in awe. And the dialogue never resolves. It's as if she's showing us how thought actually behaves in the mind. So, when we close a Lispector novel, unsure of what happened, but certain that something has shifted inside, that is the point. The book has retrained our attention. It's taught a new way of looking at the present in uncertainty. Recently, I was also watching Lispector's final interviews. She appears almost defensive when asked to interpret her work, as if afraid that too much explanation might bruise the thing itself. What we see in those interviews is a writer who has learned to live inside of unknowing. So, what do we do with her now, decades later, when interpretation has become a reflex, when we're trained to turn everything into summary or theory? I think we read her differently. We read her very slowly. We let the unfinished thoughts and the contradictions unsettle us. And I think this is because her books ask to be experienced as opposed to being understood. And I think if we surrendered to her strange rhythm, we might feel for a tiny moment what she called the living instant, the place where the mind stops naming and simply beholds. Thank you so much for watching. You'll have noticed I only referenced 4 of Clarice Lispector's book in this video for the sake of time, but there is so much left that I would love to explore. One of my favorite from Lispector's works is The Apple in the Dark. It's one that I feel is lesser read overall, maybe because of its length. I would love to make a whole video purely dedicated to this book and unpacking all that it has to say. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. And thanks. Hope you have a good day or night. Bye.